Good afternoon and welcome to the Tarrant County College Health Services Program in recognition of Sexual Assault Awareness Month. We want to thank you for attending today's event. Before we introduce our amazing speaker, I would like to take a minute to take care of a little housekeeping. Out of the respect for the presenter, all attendees have been muted and will remain muted for the duration of the presentation. We value your feedback and comments and ask that you post those as well as any questions in the Q&A section. These questions will be answered by the presenter following the presentation. At the conclusion of the presentation, please take the time to complete the evaluation that will be posted in the Q&A. Your feedback is critical for program development and improvement. As a bonus, your completed evaluation will enter you into a drawing to win one of several health and wellness prizes that will be mailed to your home address. Please note, if your instructor is offering credit for attendance, you must fill out the survey and complete the information regarding your class and instructor. This presentation is being recorded and will be available for viewing via the Health Services link that will be posted in the chat. If you have any questions, please reach out to Health Services. Now, I would like to introduce our speaker, Ms. Brenda Barajas-Koch. Ms. Barajas-Koch has worked as a prevention education specialist for the Women's Center of Tarrant County since June of 2020. Her work focuses on community education among the diverse Latinx population of North Texas, as she seeks to close the health, safety, and wellness gaps that hinder equity initiatives across many of the neighborhoods and towns that comprise the Dallas-Fort Worth metropolitan area. Brenda's activism promotes cultural humility as a culmination of the spectrum of cultural competency, and she is passionate about deconstructing assumptions of gender socialization. Prior to her current position, Brenda worked as a liaison between the Mexican consulate in Dallas and the University of North Texas Office of Outreach via the Ventanilla de Orientación Educativa program, promoting educational opportunities for the consulate's constituent populations of the Dallas-Fort Worth region and collaborating with area school districts and colleges. She holds a bachelor's degree in Spanish and a master's of arts in women's and gender studies, both from the University of North Texas, and has additionally completed extensive graduate coursework in education and Spanish from Long Island University and Brooklyn College. Ms. Barajas-Koch, it is my privilege to introduce you, and I would like to thank you for taking the time to be with us today and share your expertise so that we may learn about sexual assault awareness and violence prevention.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone at TCC Northwest Campus and just TCC District as a whole. Y'all have been incredible partners and collaborators in working with us here at the Women's Center. So I really appreciate you having me come speak to y'all during Sexual Assault Awareness and Prevention Month. At this point, I'm going to try to share my screen really quick so I can share the PowerPoint I have. So bear with me. Okay, and just if somebody could please let me know if you can see the PowerPoint and everything looks good on your end.
We can see it.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. All right, so let's get us started. So again, thank you TCC for having me. My name is Brenda Barajas-Koch, and I am, as you just heard, a prevention education specialist at the Women's Center of Tarrant County. And again, April is Sexual Assault Awareness and Prevention Month. So there are and there have been a variety of events, in the community, some virtual, where we're trying to create or spread that awareness, but also, that education component to help us all be, because in reality, we're all part of, or I hope that we all can be part of this movement to eventually end sexual violence, because it is something that is preventable. let's see. Really quick before I get into the nitty gritty of the presentation, we always start out all of our presentations with this little disclaimer that you see on the screen. And this is just to let you know that we are grant funded. Any of the opinions, analysis, or recommendations expressed here today are those of our organization, and they don't necessarily reflect those of our funders. So I did see some familiar, I recognize some names. So some of you may have already heard some of this information or seen or familiar with some of it, right? But I do want to kind of just remind everybody who we are at the Women's Center and what we do. And especially for those of you that may not know, that way you have these resources available if you need to refer somebody or if you yourself, family members, community members, students, if they need access to these resources. So the Women's Center has been around for a little over 40 years now, and our main office is here in Fort Worth, right around the corner from JPS on Hemp Hill, and we also have a satellite office in Arlington. And our mission is to inspire and empower women, men, and children to overcome violence, crisis, and poverty. So yes, you did hear that right. Even though we're called the Women's Center, we serve everyone. We serve men, anyone, and everyone. And we do this we do it through our 3 different main departments. We have an employment solutions department that helps people who are either unemployed or underemployed get employment or better employment. And they do this through a variety of different programming. And then we also have a general counseling department that focuses primarily on those general kind of mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, grief, loss, divorce, self-esteem issues, and they offer counseling, case management, legal clinics, and support groups. And they work very closely with the homeless shelters in Tarrant County and the elderly and aging population. They have a specific program for older adults in conjunction with the Department of Aging. And then our largest department is our Rape, Crisis, and Victim Services Department. So what that means is that the Women's Center is the Rape Crisis Center for all of Tarrant County. And clients who come to us through our Rape, Crisis, and Victim Services Department have access to free services for victims of sexual assault and abuse or any other type of violent crime. And they have counseling, case management, and a 24-hour crisis hotline that you can see on the screen here. And we also have a lawyer and legal assistant on staff who provide free legal services for clients who have been victimized. And then we also offer a really important program, and I'm actually going to be talking about this a little more in detail in the presentation. We have a hospital accompaniment program for victims who are getting a forensic exam after a sexual assault. And then under Rape, Crisis, and Victim Services, we have our Violence Prevention and Education program. So that's the community education team that I work with. And we're kind of like a sub-department within Rape, Crisis, and Victim Services. And that's actually, what I'm doing here today. Part of community education, part of violence prevention is education. It's me being out in the community, collaborating with different entities on, educating and spreading awareness on these issues, but learning how to respond, learning about risk reduction, but also really learning how can we prevent these things from happening in the first place. And if you have any questions about, our programming or our agency, please feel free, at the end, hopefully we'll have a little bit of time and I'll give my contact information as well so you can reach out. But these are our objectives for today for this particular presentation. This is what I hope to accomplish with you today. And I'll give you, I know most of us can read, so I'll just give you a few seconds to kind of, glance over those so that you know what we're about to get into. And as you're reading those, I will also, I want to point out that I understand that this can be a really heavy, difficult topic to talk about, learn about, and it can be triggering for some people. So please feel free to take care of yourself at any point. If you need to get up, get a drink of water, take a deep breath, please feel free to do so. All right, so first I want to start this out by actually defining sexual assault. What is that? What's the actual definition of that? So generally speaking, sexual assault is an act of violence, okay? And we're going to be talking a little more in depth about coercion and exactly what that means, what it can look like, and here in just a bit. But I do want people to keep in mind that definitions of sexual assault may vary depending on, if we're talking about legal terms or the penal code. Different advocacy organizations and school or university policies are going to kind of affect what the exact definition of sexual assault. So when it comes to sexual assault and the Texas Penal Code, sexual assault is the same thing as rape, right? Rape is sexual assault is rape, and it is an act of violence. And ultimately, we know that all sexual violence is rooted, and I'm going to say this over and over again, but it's rooted in power and control, right? We're constantly trying to, communicate to folks that this isn't about love. This isn't about sex. This isn't about intimacy. It's about power and control. That's what it boils down to. And it's imperative to understand that it's about power and control. The state of Texas actually has a pretty comprehensive definition, especially compared to other states. I do encourage people sometimes, if you're interested, you can go and see other states' statutes and their penal codes, and Texas does a pretty good job making it comprehensive. So, consent, really, it comes down to consent. Consent is that dividing line between sex and sexual assault. And, when it comes to consent, what I tell people, sometimes, especially when we're talking to younger kiddos, what is that? Consent is permission, right? Consent is an agreement between both parties. And, more importantly, consent is a yes, but the absence of a no does not equal consent, right? And you'll notice that under this the penal code, it says consent has been withdrawn. And if anyone's wondering, well, what does consent has been withdrawn? What does that exactly mean? What does it look like? So, in order to withdraw consent, at some point the person had to give consent, right? And it means that they've changed their mind. So is it okay to change your mind? Yes, absolutely. Is it ever too late to change your mind? Is there like a point of no return, right? No. I'll point out, and we'll talk a little bit about rape culture here in just a minute, but some signs of rape culture being present is when consent is misunderstood and misrepresented, right? So when people talk about rape culture, consent does fall under that. So again, consent must be ongoing. So now I'm going to show you a quick video that does a great job at illustrating this point of consent.
If you're still struggling with consent, just imagine instead of initiating sex, you're making them a cup of tea. You say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they go, "Oh my God, I would love a cup of tea. Thank you." Then you know they want a cup of tea. If you say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they're like, I'm not really sure. Then you could make them a cup of tea or not, but be aware they might not drink it. And if they don't drink it, then, and this is the important part, don't make them drink it. Just because you made it doesn't mean you are entitled to watch them drink it. And if they say no, thank you, then don't make them tea at all. Just don't make them tea. Don't make them drink tea. Don't get annoyed at them for not wanting tea. They just don't want tea, okay? They might say, "Yes, please. That's kind of you." And then when the tea arrives, they actually don't want the tea at all. Sure, that's kind of annoying as you've gone to all the effort of making the tea, but they remain under no obligation to drink the tea. They did want tea, now they don't. Some people change their mind in the time that it takes to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk. And it's okay for people to change their mind. And you are still not entitled to watch them drink it. And if they're unconscious, don't make them tea. Unconscious people don't want tea. And they can't answer the question, "Do you want tea?" because they're unconscious. Okay, maybe they were conscious when you asked them if they wanted tea. And they said yes. But in the time it took you to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk, they are now unconscious. You should just put the tea down. Make sure the unconscious person is safe. And this is the important part again. Don't make them drink the tea. They said yes then, sure, but Unconscious people don't want tea. If someone said yes to tea, started drinking it, and then passed out before they'd finished it, don't keep on pouring it down their throat. Take the tea away. Make sure they're safe, because unconscious people don't want tea. Trust me on this. If someone said yes to tea around your house last Saturday, that doesn't mean they want you to make them tea all the time. They don't want you to come around to their place unexpectedly and make them tea and force them to drink it, going, but you wanted tea last week. Or to wake up to find you pouring tea down their throat, going, but you wanted tea last night. But if you can understand how completely ludicrous it is to force people to have tea when they don't want tea, and you're able to understand when people don't want tea, then how hard is it to understand it when it comes to sex? Whether it's tea or sex, consent is everything. And on that note, I'm going to go make myself a cup of tea.
Okay, so moving us along, I do want to point out that coercion was added to Texas law in 2017, right? So that was just added, I guess, about 5 years ago now. But it is important to highlight this. I don't expect everybody to read or, memorize everything that's on this slide, because I know it's a lot, and it's a lot of legal jargon too. But, it's important that this was added because frequently I think a lot of people, may think there's still some of those pervasive myths that sexual assault happens and, the perpetrator or the abuser may threaten the other person with a weapon or in some physical way, right? And that's not to say that it doesn't. Oh, there are those situations, but, sometimes there are threats where they didn't use weapons or physical force or something like that. And sometimes the coercion in these situations could be verbal or psychological manipulation. And that piece, a lot of times, is so strong that this is important to know, right? That coercion is part of Texas law. So what does coercion look like exactly? And a lot of times, when we're out in schools and K through 12 school or settings, talking to high schoolers, stuff like that, it's important to define exactly what we mean by coercion and what that can look like. So what you see on your screen now, these are examples of coercion in a general sense, not necessarily in a legal sense, but generally. This could be the beginning, some of those red flags that we like to tell people to kind of just be paying attention to that, because this can be the beginning of more forceful or coercive behaviors or manipulation, right? And other examples I'd like to point out are using something like sextortion, right? So extortion involving whether it's nude images, photographs, text messages, that sort of thing, and revenge porn, right? That's coercion. Another situation where we see coercion a lot is, with undocumented populations, for instance. So people can and will use someone's immigration status to coerce them by withholding documentation or threatening to withhold that documentation in order for it to be processed or something like that. And, they may threaten deportation and that kind of thing. So that's another example. So again, the key here is consent. And Texas law doesn't really define consent. But again, what I want to point out is that, sometimes a yes is out of coercion, and there needs to be that affirmative, enthusiastic, ongoing consent. Okay. All right, so when it comes to the framework of how we approach these issues, how I approach them and how we approach them here at the Women's Center in a more comprehensive, holistic way, I always tell people that regardless of criminality, legal definitions or not, trauma can still happen when with anything that involves sexual violence or falls under that umbrella. So, what you see on your screen is called the sexual violence continuum, and this is more of a visual depiction of what I'm talking about today. And, like I said, here at the Women's Center, we use a holistic and comprehensive approach to sexual violence prevention work. And I didn't create this visual, but I 100% agree with the author who created this, that this visual depiction, it's really, what's important to point out is that it's really impossible to end a single form of oppression that you see here at the middle and all of the isms that go along with that, right? So we're really focused on sexism for today's topic. But really, to work to end one of the isms, whether it be sexism, racism, ableism, classism, etc., it requires us to work to end them all, okay? And what I mean by this, again, if all sexual violence is rooted in power and control, the oppression you see at the center of the continuum, they all have those same roots, those same root causes, right? So it's not enough for us to eradicate something like rape, even though that would be amazing. I always tell people, I kind of joke, but I really do think this. I'm trying to work myself out of a job, right? This really is not just a job. It's a movement, and I consider myself as part of a movement to eventually live in a world where we have eliminated something like sexual violence. So yes, even though, we would love to eradicate rape, and that would be amazing, but it's not the only form of sexual violence or violence in general, right? So it's often an escalation of things like sexual harassment, sexist jokes, sexual exploitation, rigidly enforcing or policing gender roles, normalized gender violence, overly sexualized media, etc. These are normally, they may seem in some instances as harmless, right? Or a lot of like, oh, well, it's just a joke type of thing. But if you notice some of those early stages that I just mentioned, these behaviors might seem harmless or very distanced, right, from the extreme end of the continuum, like rape and murder. However, these elements of oppression that, we're seeing here and these earlier stages, it's what leads to those everyday problematic and disrespectful behaviors that can, when they're excused and normalized in our society, lead to more prevalence of major crimes like rape and murder. And, all of this is a progression, and the steps that you see here build upon one another. So it's important to try to disrupt this before it escalates. And part of what we're doing today, hopefully, is disrupting this with education and information. So now I'm going to get into some statistics here, especially for a lot of folks that aren't necessarily, in the nitty gritty doing this work day in and day out. There may be some myths when it comes to stats, or some people aren't familiar. But I do want to point out, it's really important to look at the data, because you'd be surprised, but even in 2022, I get varied answers when I'm like, how prevalent do you think, how common do you think this is? And I'll have some people like very common, but there's other people that are like, I don't think it's, that common. Or when I tell them what I do for a living, some people are like, wait, there's a whole agency dedicated to just that. So this is when I point out, that 2 in 5 women in Texas are survivors of sexual assault. And 1 in 5 men in Texas are also survivors of sexual assault. In 8 out of 10 cases of rape, the victim actually knew their perpetrator. So with that one, if you think about it, in 80% of cases of rape, victims actually know who their abuser is. It's important to point out that this whole myth that a lot of us grew up with of like stranger danger, or that it's some like creepy looking person jumping out of like the bushes in the middle of the night and, is going to sexually assault us, that's not necessarily the case most of the time, right? Most of the time it's people that you trust, that you're familiar with, that you know. And ages 12 to 34 are highest risk for sexual assault. And then when it comes to children, we do know that 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys experience sexual abuse by their 18th birthday. So that's why I do think it's important to highlight this, but to go a little bit deeper with it, even though statistics are really important and highlighting that this is, this is a public health issue, and that it's very common and people shouldn't feel alone in their experiences, because unfortunately, as you can see, it happens a lot. But also keep in mind that data sometimes doesn't reflect the entire picture, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about this, and it goes into the fact when it comes to reporting or disclosing abuse, a lot of these cases or these things happen where people sometimes may not even recognize that what happened to them as a crime, as an act of sexual violence or sexual assault, and they may not even be talking to anybody about it. So let alone reporting to police or in research studies, right? So these numbers could in reality be much higher. So, and that actually goes right into with this slide with dealing with populations with higher rates of victimization. If you think about it, I already talked a little bit about immigrants, but also, people who are part of the LGBTQ community, sex workers, people with substance use disorders, people who are experiencing homelessness, mental health conditions, victims of domestic violence. There's a direct link there, right? So if you look at, these particular populations and groups of people, then it's even more understandable why in some communities there's going to be more barriers to reporting or to accessing services and really talking about this or recognizing it as abuse. So let's get into some of those myths and reporting. So when it comes to reporting, the data that you see here comes from a study conducted by the University of Texas, Austin, where they found that, when it comes to something like reporting or disclosing their victimization, about 45% of survivors do disclose to a friend, 31% report to a family member, and almost 17% would seek help by disclosing or reaching out to an intimate partner. And then it goes down, the numbers go down a little bit when it comes to, like 15% would report to a social worker or a helping professional. And as you see, that's highlighted here, only about 9% actually reported to law enforcement. Then only 6% sought medical care, and that's that forensic exam that I mentioned earlier, that part where we, go out to the hospital to provide that accompaniment. But only about 6% seek medical care. And as you see, very few, call a crisis hotline sometimes or get that forensic exam. But in this study, they also talked about the reasons why we see that these numbers are so low. And again, we know that there are so many myths in our general culture and society, right, that really contribute to these low rates of reporting. So I typically like to ask people, why do you think that more people don't come forward? And, I do hear a lot of people come up with like, oh, people are afraid. People fear that they're not going to be believed. And actually what we see in this research is that, yes, the number one reason that, victims didn't report is because they thought that nobody would believe them. A lot of times we see too that victims blame themselves. They're too scared to report, or they choose to deal with the sexual assault themselves or ask their friends or family for help. Because a lot of times victims, want to forget about it and move on with their lives. Or they may be worried about jeopardizing, their immigration status or job. A lot of different factors go into this. But all of these myths contribute to low rates of reporting. And we'll talk a little bit more about some more general myths too that we see just culturally. But I just think it's, important to know these because it's still, even though we may personally not hold these myths, it's still, an underlying like common denominator in our society, right? And although victims may choose to deal with the assault themselves or they want to just move on, it's important to, I can't, underscore this enough, or it's trauma. It's still a traumatic event. And from what we know here at the Women's Center, trauma doesn't just stop, it doesn't just end, and it spreads to the people around us. So another common myth is the fact, we see this a lot, especially, when it comes to dealing with college campuses or dealing with student populations. Oh, well, and it can be internalized myths that the victim holds themselves and have internalized, or like I said, society as a whole. The idea that, someone was really drunk or really high or had been drinking, taking part of like this risky behavior. So that's a pretty common one. But, going back to that video that we watched, if someone is under the influence to the point or somebody's blacked out, they're unable to communicate, obviously they cannot give consent, right? Another common one that we see a lot is that spouses cannot sexually assault their partner. They're married, so therefore that can't really be considered sexual assault, right? And I do want to point out here that marital rape exemptions were removed from Texas law in 1994. And other states still have those exemptions, like till this day. So it's important to understand this. How someone is dressed is another really common one, right? That goes into the whole like, oh, they looked like they were asking for it type of behavior. But most commonly, what I do want to share, the most commonly worn item of clothing at a time of sexual assault, even though some people might say like a skirt, a short dress, that sort of thing. Just so y'all know, the number one item was blue jeans. And then number two was sweatpants or PJs. And what that tells us is that, it kind of makes sense if you think about the fact that in 8 out of every 10 cases of rape, the person knows who their perpetrator is. So most of the time it's going to be, where you're wearing that comfortable everyday type of clothes type of situation. Again, another really common one is, well, they never said no. So, but silence again is not the same as consent. And I want people to think about those fight, flight, and freeze responses that our brain automatically goes into when we're in situations where we're fearful or under kind of like alert, right? And then another really common one is that people falsely report sexual assault all the time. There's so many, false allegations or false reporting, but actually the rate of false reporting for sexual assault is the same as any other crime, about 2.5%, right? And in some cases, other crimes, I've seen some data that points that they have higher rates of false reporting. And if you think about that, we typically don't treat other criminal situations in that same way, right? Like if somebody says, I was mugged and they took my watch and they took my wallet, we don't question that, right? They're like, are they telling the truth? We don't put them under necessarily that same scrutiny. And this video that I'm going to show you now kind of goes a little bit more into that.
I was 22 when I was raped.
I was 19. I was 20.
I didn't report it for, 1,000 reasons, a million reasons.
It was somebody I was involved with.
It was a friend of a friend.
My drug dealer.
Met this photographer by myself.
I got very drunk. I met some guy in this bar.
He started trying to kiss me and I said no.
He takes my left leg and raises it on his shoulder.
He went to put his hand in my panties and I tried to kind of deflect his hand, and that's when he slapped my hand away.
I blacked out.
I was fighting like pretty hard at this point, just saying no, please don't, please don't.
I came to.
Internally, I was shaking. I was really trying to look as calm as possible.
I could tell that something that I hadn't wanted to happen happened.
He held me down and he forced himself inside me.
I was being pleasant and nice just so I could remain safe and get out of there.
And I kind of just ran out into the street with like my pants on inside out and my shoes off.
And he sat up and he looked at me, and that was, I guess, the scariest moment for me, because I could tell he was deciding whether he was actually going to stop or not. And that was the moment that I realized that I had thought I was in control of a situation that I was not in control of at all.
And I blame myself for putting myself in that situation.
I knew that I had no proof.
I could hear people's judgment saying, well, why did you do that? It was your fault.
I was still in like physical pain from this and sitting there going, oh, well, no one's gonna believe me.
It was my word against his.
Everyone was just gonna go, this girl just, slept with this guy and changed her mind.
I wasn't the perfect victim.
I figured who was gonna believe some cokehead college girl.
I didn't try to fight him off, or I didn't slap him around, or, I didn't pick up the phone and call 911.
I didn't know that I was important enough to draw boundaries around what people could and couldn't do with my body. Who wants to come forward with the literal most violating thing that can happen to you, relive it, and then have people telling you that you're making it up.
And I thought I would just be better off trying to put this behind me.
I couldn't imagine pressing charges and then having to sit in a courtroom and look at his face over and over.
I thought, well, you know, that's like giving him what he wants. Like, I'm spending more time on him or spending more energy on this.
I imagine, and I think rightfully so, that it would have been more traumatizing for me in many ways had I reported it.
It's up to a survivor to decide what they do with their story. It's up to them if they want to report it or not.
I don't want this to be a part of who I am.
I hated myself a lot at the time.
We are violated, we are harassed, we are touched, we're trapped, we're scared. And we just take a chip on the shoulder and we keep our lives going, and that's not fair to us.
And I think it would be wrong to tell them that they don't get to decide what happens next.
Okay, so I know that one in particular is a hard one to watch, and I've seen it a million times in the 2 years that I've been working here, and it's still really hard for me to watch that. So like I said earlier, please feel free to take some deep breaths. If you need to step away for a second, that's fine. But moving along, and like they were saying in the video, when it comes to, adult victims, we should keep this centered on the survivor. It needs to be survivor centered. The movement, to end sexual violence should be survivor led, right? And obviously we need allies in this work. But when I was speaking about it being traumatic, is that sometimes what's empowering and how trauma spreads, but what's empowering to one survivor isn't necessarily empowering to everyone, right? So it may be that going through that criminal justice process, especially with certain communities and certain survivors, like that may not be necessarily what, at certain times what they want to, or what they choose to do with what happened to them. And so we need to be understanding of that. But just know, we have plenty of survivors here at the Women's Center who come and seek counseling, or their family members and friends, support systems will come and seek counseling as well. And, that's totally fine. We don't require that you go through the criminal justice process. But, we're trying to give people back some of that power and control that was taken away from them, right? So another really important resource to share with you all, which I already talked about it a little bit, is that our hospitals have a sexual assault nurse examiner program, or we shorten it to the acronym, it's called the SANE program. And going back to the fact that these crimes, being so underreported, well, this is a crime, right? And in these cases, a victim's body is the crime scene. So I really want people to know that when we're talking about forensic rape exams, most of you have probably heard of rape kits, right? It's the same thing, it's a rape kit. What's part of a forensic rape exam is, and it's a really important resource to share with you all, so that people are aware of victims' rights. This is also, another resource that you can share with the survivors. So the hospitals have this program, and in these cases, what people can do is the victim gets a free exam. So it's a free examination where the survivor receives prophylactic treatment for STDs and pregnancy, so those preventative medications. Victims do have a 120-hour, so that comes out to a 5-day window for that DNA collection. And that DNA collection is part of that rape kit, right? So you have 5 days after an assault has occurred, and victims 18 and over, so adults, are not required to report to law enforcement. So you can get what's called a non-report exam. And, again, that choice is entirely up to the survivor. And just so you know, the evidence is stored for up to 5 years in case at some point the victim does change their mind and they decide that they want to report to law enforcement using that evidence, that DNA collection. And I have a short video that goes into kind of explaining exactly how that works.
There are more than 100,000 sexual assaults committed every year in the U.S. and survivors have no way of knowing if their sexual assault kit has been tested. Until now. Our secure web-based system, TrackIt, provides tracking and status updates 24 hours a day to everyone involved in collecting and processing sexual assault cases, including survivors. TrackIt ensures that all stakeholders are informed. It also tracks testing status and prevents kits from being delayed or lost. Most importantly, TrackIt allows survivors to easily and discreetly track the location and status of their sexual assault kit. The tracking process begins as soon as a nurse scans a kit into the system. TrackIt then notifies the proper law enforcement agency that the kit is ready for pickup. TrackIt records precisely when law enforcement picks up the kit and when they deliver it to the DNA laboratory. Lab staff can view the status of all collected kits that are in transit to their lab. They are immediately notified if delivery or lab testing is late. Prosecuting attorneys can easily review information on kits assigned to their jurisdictions. Survivors of sexual assaults have the option to receive email and text notifications concerning their kit's tracking status. TrackIt also provides them access to resources and contact information. TrackIt keeps everyone in the loop from the moment a sexual assault kit is collected until results are reported. Contact Stax DNA for a TrackIt demo or to learn more.
Okay, so some of you may have heard in the last, few years, there were cases in other states that, I think it was in Detroit and Michigan, where they discovered that there was this warehouse where all these rape kits, all this forensic evidence, was just sitting there for years and years, and there was like a backlog of processing that. And then that led to, the story made the news, and that led to other states starting to check, and they saw that we were all having the same issues. So that's why it is different now. A lot of people think like, oh, they're not going to do anything. They're not going to, and that was, what was going on. But fortunately, just know when it comes to a survivor or a victim's rights, this is part of their rights, and it is something that is, a very useful tool to know that it's there and that you can use. But again, I've been talking about sexual assault and sexual violence as types of trauma, right? So we need to broaden our understanding that these types of, whether it comes to something being, a criminal act, or even when we're talking about sexist jokes or those microaggressions, policing gender roles, those sorts of things, depending on, the context there and the person, these things, it's still trauma. I think a lot of people sometimes, or our understanding for a long time of trauma is like we automatically think like war veterans, PTSD, and yes, but all of these other issues that we've been exploring today and talking about also are a form of trauma. So to really understand, what trauma actually means, I'll briefly touch on this. So here's a definition of trauma according to SAMHSA. And this can result for, it's a normal response to an abnormal event, basically. So that's kind of like, long story short, individual trauma is a normal response to an abnormal event. And this can result from one event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances experienced by someone either as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening. And this has adverse effects on the person's functioning and their well-being. So it's important, that to know that this is something that the individual was not prepared for. The event was unexpected. There was nothing that person could do to prevent this from happening, and sometimes, and it can overwhelm a person's ability to cope, okay? So there are 3 types of trauma that you see here. You have acute trauma, and that results from one single incident, and then chronic trauma, which is results from ongoing exposure to a single event, and you see some examples listed. And then complex trauma, and that's when someone's experiencing multiple traumatic events interpersonal in nature, and often that's what we're talking about with complex trauma, and it's chronic, right? And some other examples are homelessness, interpersonal or domestic violence, child abuse. I talked about military experience or being in combat, that sort of thing. So this is what that trauma, when it's playing out or somebody's experienced this, what it can look like, right? These are short-term and long-term effects. So when it comes to depression and anxiety, we know that somebody who has experienced or been a victim of sexual violence, they are 3 times more likely to suffer from depression and anxiety. Suicide ideations and self-harm, people are 4 times more likely to have those suicidal ideations or do self-harm. And then with alcohol abuse, we know that it's 13 times more likely when somebody has experienced this, that they'll, abuse alcohol. And drug abuse is 26 times more likely. So it's really important, I keep saying that about everything because I think all of it's important, but we're all aware of the effects that this has on survivors, and know that experiencing, again, any type of these, whether it's domestic violence, sexual violence, it's a form of trauma, and that it can lead to things like PTSD and acute stress disorder, depression, that difficulty setting boundaries, that avoidant behavior that we may see, difficulty sleeping. And again, we know that trauma spreads. It can also have effects not just on the survivor themselves, but also that person that's their support system that's going through this with them, and a lot of times, right? And that's why it's really important to recognize these effects and know that there is hope. I know a lot of this seems very hopeless and it's frustrating, and it should be, but there is hope and healing, and everybody involved here can receive services. So when it comes to, individually, what are some things that we can do to help survivors in a trauma-informed way, right? So to kind of start wrapping things up and leave some time for questions, I want to conclude with giving y'all some tools on how to respond when someone discloses or shares with you that they're a survivor, that this happened to them. And we mainly use, this model when we're talking about sexual assault, sexual abuse type of situations, but you can really use it with anything that is, if you're, doing things in a trauma-informed way, it's a great tool to use in any traumatic event. So we call this the BASER model because each letter, BASER, stands for something. And the B, as you can see, stands for believe. And what that means is you can just simply say, I believe what you're telling me. So we know, after we've explored and talked about all of those myths and, different situations, whether they're internalized myths or what we have out there, that plays out into society as a whole. And the fact that the number one reason for not reporting is that victims feel like they're not going to be believed. It's really important that when somebody shares something like this with you, you understand that you're not the investigator, you're not a detective. Your role is to believe them and support them, right? So tell them, I believe what you're telling me. Also acknowledge the importance of talking about the abuse and getting help. So you can say something like, I'm glad you told me about this. Thank you for telling me. And then when it comes to support, reinforce that idea that the abuse is not their fault and that they are not to blame regardless of the circumstances. We always tell people over and over, this was not your fault, right? And then empower a victim. If we go back to those root causes of power and control, by affirming, supporting, and educating victims about available resources, you're then giving them back some of that control over their life, right? Because a lot of times people do feel helpless and powerless, so it's really important that we empower them. And then lastly, very important, refer, right? So contact, like I said, we are the Rape Crisis Center for Tarrant County, so please contact the Women's Center or a local rape crisis center, depending on where you live, for counseling referrals. And you'll have a lot of awesome, excellent resources at each of your campuses as well. So there are different ways that people can collaborate and, make sure that we're sharing those resources and referring people. This is the CDC's, the Center for Disease Control, what they call their Stop Sexual Violence model. So just so that you know, you can Google this and go to their website, because I think it's important to be aware of kind of, their strategies. So the S in STOP, it talks about promoting those social norms that protect against violence. So some of those protective factors, right? So yes, there are risk factors, but know that there are also protective factors. And they approach this with talking about bystander intervention or bystander approaches and mobilizing men and boys as allies. Okay. So also we want to teach skills to prevent sexual violence. And this is anything from, social emotional learning, teaching healthy, safe dating and intimate relationship skills to teens, especially promoting healthy sexuality and empowerment-based training. Well, they also talk about providing opportunities to empower and support girls and women. So, that goes into things like strengthening economic supports for women and families and strengthening leadership and opportunities in general for girls. And then you want to create those protective environments. So improving safety and monitoring in schools, on campus, at colleges and universities, and establishing and consistently applying workplace policies and addressing those community level risks through environmental approaches. And then supporting victims and survivors to lessen harms. So again, that goes to that those victim-centered services, treatment, and treatment for at-risk children and families to prevent problem behavior, including sex offending. So, again, I want to reiterate, there is hope in healing, and healing and recovery are possible. It doesn't matter if what happened to someone was yesterday, last week, last year, or if it happened 40 years ago or 50 years ago. We always tell people it's never, ever, ever too late to start healing or to continue, that healing process. Again, sexual assault is trauma, but healing and recovery, are possible. So we do have that 24-hour crisis hotline, and this can help with recurring trauma and flashbacks. And again, trauma not only affects the victim, it also affects those close to the victim. And, our department, Rape Crisis and Victim Services, offers those free services for victims or survivors in those secondary, what we call secondary survivors or secondary victims. And that can be, that family member, that friend, that support system. So here are some additional resources, and I can send these out. I can email them, or somebody can contact me. I'm going to give you my email here in just a second. But these are local and some state level, and RAINN at the bottom, the Rape and Incest National Network, is a national resource, and they have really great educational materials. A lot of great research has come from them. So if you're interested in learning more. And the same thing with TASA, which is our Texas Association Against Sexual Assault. They have a lot of great information in Spanish as well. And then here are my references. So I do know that y'all have to complete an evaluation for TCC. So if you don't mind, this is for grant purposes and just to help us, tweak these materials or better serve our community partners. I have a short, quick evaluation that you can scan here with this QR code, and it's just like 4 questions. But, feel free to scan it, and then if you need to complete it later, you don't have to do it right this second. But, again, sexual assault can happen to anyone. It's, it's a crime that does not discriminate, and it will always be traumatic for victims, regardless of any communities to which they belong. However, it's important to have, that understanding of how a victim's community affiliations may affect their response to the sexual assault. Want to make sure I highlight that. But at this point, this is my information, so please feel free to take a quick picture, a screenshot of that. And there's our 24-hour crisis hotline again, and feel free to email me with, any questions, or if you want a copy of the PowerPoint, I am, more than happy to send that out. And now we have about 5 minutes, but if anybody has any comments, questions, concerns.
Hi, Brenda.
Hi.
This is Courtney Pickens with Dash, and I just wanted to see if you can ask or answer the question about uh, can an advocate be present at the SANE exam, or can you request someone to be there, or even like if it's a friend or anybody, like is there a way that they can have someone there to basically hold their hand or give them resources and stuff like that?
Yes, that's a really, really good question, and nice to see, see and hear you, Courtney, by the way. But yes, that's a really, really good question. So part of our hospital accompaniment program that we have here in my department is having those community-based advocates, right? So when somebody shows up at any of our area hospitals here in Tarrant County, the first thing that'll happen is that SANE nurse they'll give us a call. And this is 24/7, 365 days a year. It doesn't matter the time, whether it's a holiday or not. They'll call and we send a community-based advocate. And I am part of that group as well that sometimes has to go out and do this. And we will be there exactly like you're saying to provide that emotional support, to that accompaniment, to kind of walk you through the process. And we provide, basic items like toiletries and clothes, flip-flops, that sort of thing, because a lot of times your clothes is taken as evidence, right? And they'll also provide resources. So we show up with a little envelope that has everything like highlighted and there for you, because it's a lot. People are processing a lot of information, and it is something that it's hard to process and deal with, obviously. So we put that all together for you and just give it to you for when you're ready to, seek some or look into some of those resources. And I believe that, yes, you can have a friend, family member. We've seen that quite a bit where somebody will have mom present or a friend or something like that. And this is at JPS is the largest program in Tarrant County, but all other Texas Health Resources has a SANE program. Arlington, I think that's part of Texas Health Resources too, but there's 7 total. Good question. Anybody else?
There were a couple questions in the chat if you wanted to share they had a couple questions.
Let me see if I can, let me go back to the chat now. There you go. Oh.
If you can't see them, I can read them. I think Lisa's mic might not be working right now.
Okay.
One of them was, how long ago does the sexual assault have to have occurred to avail yourself of the counseling services?
Oh, so, yes, I did mention that 5-day window, right, for the forensic evidence collection. But when it comes to counseling, here at the Women's Center, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. The oldest victim we've seen here was 98 years old. So, it doesn't matter your age. It doesn't matter how long ago it occurred. That, we're here to help anyone and everyone, regardless of, time frame.
Okay. Another, someone said, thank you for a great presentation. I really appreciate it. Let's see. Someone asked, how often are you able to present this information to the local ISDs within Tarrant County?
Great question. That gives me an opportunity to talk about it's called Play It Safe, our Play It Safe program, where this is a research-based, evidence-based program, and we've been doing it for decades now. We go out into schools in Tarrant County. It's a free program to talk to kiddos in an age-appropriate way about these issues and how to prevent them. We do some risk reduction, and each grade level has their own presentation, and we have videos that accompany it. So we're going out to schools yearly, right? Like every year we're out there. We have trainers that go out and do these presentations. And we always stress to people that, Unfortunately, we're only there one day out of the year, but we'll be back next year. We grow with the kids. So we presented to them in kindergarten. Next year, they'll see us for first grade. And that's why we also encourage our parent education programs. That way you can supplement and continue having these conversations at home in the community. And then we obviously go out into the community as well.
Okay. And I saw that Courtney had a question, but I think she might have already asked it.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay. And those are the only questions that I see. There are a lot of thank yous. Thank you from South Campus. Thank you. It's an incredible presentation going over this topic. And thank you for the presentation and the resources.
Thank you all. Thank you for being such a great audience, and thank you for tuning in.
I just want to make sure that there were no more questions before we close out. And I don't see any more questions.
Okay.
We want to thank Ms. Barajas Koch for an informative presentation and time today. Additionally, we want to thank all of our participants for your attendance today. Please remember to complete the evaluation that is posted in the Q&A. We will be sending attendance information to your instructors from fully completed evaluations only.